Usually when we talk about diagnosing some kind of complex system like whether it's a piece of software failing or, I don't know, a human body running a fever, there's this universal expectation of precision.
Right, yeah. Like it's engineering.
Exactly. We approach it like engineering. If you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the bone, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is. That's the point of failure.
It gives you that comforting binary, like
Yeah.
the bone is broken or it's intact. The treatment plan basically writes itself.
Yeah, and we deeply crave that exact same diagnostic simplicity when we look at nations. We want to look at a country's macroeconomic dashboard, wait for like one red flashing light to appear and say, aha, just tighten that fiscal valve and the nation will thrive.
If only it were that easy.
Right. But when you actually step into the reality of macroeconomics and social governance, suddenly that X-ray machine is, well, it's utterly useless.
Totally useless.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky, where a symptom in one sector is actually the cure for another.
Because the variables are just inextricably linked. I mean, you can't isolate a nation's inflation rate from its educational policy or its healthcare outcomes from its global supply chain integration.
Which brings us to today's topic, the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are looking at a country that basically did exactly what the global developmental consensus tells developing nations to do.
Yeah, they really follow the playbook.
They conquered infectious diseases, they poured resources into their youth, they achieved this near universal youth literacy rate of 99%.
Which is staggering.
Right. They built the perfect human engine, and yet the car is still struggling to move forward. So today, we're opening the hood on the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to find out why doing everything right on paper still isn't enough.
It's quite a story.
We're looking at a highly detailed 15-slide macroeconomic and social governance presentation today, and we are going to explore the population dynamics, the volatility of their economic engine, the intense straitjacket of national debt, and the vital role of institutional governance.
What's fascinating here is how Jordan serves as this perfect real-world laboratory to observe what happens when a country aggressively builds its human capital, but at the same time faces severe structural economic bottlenecks.
Yeah.
It really challenges that fundamental assumption that education just automatically translates into national wealth.
Exactly. So if you are listening right now, whether you're managing an emerging markets portfolio or you're into geopolitics or you just want to know how a country's internal gears actually turn, this deep dive is basically a masterclass in reading a nation's balance sheet.
It really is.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to start with the most fundamental building block of any nation. It's people. Slide 3 in our sources focuses heavily on demographic structure.
Right, because if you want to accurately forecast a country's trajectory over, say, a 50-year horizon, the absolute worst place to look is its current bank account.
You have to look at the demographic.
You have to. Demographics are like the tectonic plates of macroeconomics. They move slowly, but they dictate the shape of literally everything on the surface.
And the data here puts a massive spotlight on this concept of the youth dividend. Decades ago, Jordan had a youth dependency ratio hovering around the 100% mark.
Which is a massive burden.
Right. So for you listening, think about your own financial balance sheet. Imagine what that means at a societal level. For every single working-age adult, there was roughly one child to support. All the economic output is instantly consumed by just the basic, caloric and developmental needs of the youth.
Yeah, the dependency ratio is basically a measure of societal pressure. When you have a massive population of children, working adults deploy all their excess capital simply to keep those kids fed, clothed, housed.
Just baseline survival.
Exactly. In that environment, there is virtually no surplus capital available for national savings. And no savings means no domestic investment in infrastructure or enterprise. You're just running on a treadmill.
But the data in this presentation shows a beautiful, sweeping release of that pressure. That youth dependency line drops smoothly down to around 70%.
It's a huge shift.
And simultaneously, the old age dependency ratio, so the proportion of elderly people relying on workers, stays remarkably flat and low, somewhere between 4.1 and 5.4%.
This specific configuration, It's the holy grail of demographic shifts for a developing economy.
The demographic window.
Yes, the pressure of child rearing has eased and the burden of elder care hasn't materialized yet. So you have this massive, unprecedented bulge of working-age individuals.
An army of potential labor.
Right, a society that can theoretically transition from pure consumption to actual wealth accumulation.
But here's where the story gets wildly interesting. It's not just about the raw number of youths. It's about the quality of the minds entering the labor pool. The data on slide 6 about education is it's a public policy triumph.
It really is impressive.
We're looking at a youth literacy rate, specifically ages 15 to 24, that sits near or above 99%.
99%.
99%.
You know, achieving near universal youth literacy in a developing economy, especially one situated in a highly volatile region, that doesn't just happen by accident.
No. Definitely not.
And it doesn't happen through short-term political initiatives either. It requires decades of, well, what we might call institutional stubbornness.
Institutional stubbornness, I like that. And we can actually quantify that, right?
Right.
Slide 9 tracks government expenditure. It shows that despite financial crises or regional shocks, the government fiercely defended a fiscal baseline for education.
They absolutely ring-fenced it.
They locked in education spending at between 9 and 13% of total government expenditure year after year.
That fiscal commitment is the invisible architecture behind that 99% literacy rate. When a state allocates a double-digit percentage of its entire budget to education through recessions and crises,
It's a huge bet.
it's a profound intergenerational bet. They are betting that highly cultivated human capital will eventually outyield any other form of investment.
Okay, but this brings us to the collision point of this whole deep dive.
Well-
You have the demographic dividend. You have a 99% literate youth cohort. You've basically manufactured premium, high-octane human capital.
Yeah.
But then you look at the labor market data, and the metric for vulnerable employment remains stubbornly high. It just fluctuates endlessly between 9 and 15% of total employment.
And that tension right there, the 99% literacy versus up to 15% vulnerable employment, that is the defining paradox of Jordan's modern macroeconomic landscape.
It's totally mismatched.
The state fulfilled its social contract regarding education. It supplied the market with incredibly high-quality human capital. But the macroeconomic engine is basically failing to absorb them efficiently.
Wait, I have to push back on this a little bit. If you have a 99% literate, digitally native youth population, why isn't the economy automatically booming? I mean, in Western economies, we see massive swaths of the population doing gig work, freelance coding, consulting.
Yeah, the gig economy.
Yeah. It lacks traditional contracts, so it's technically vulnerable on a spreadsheet, but it's highly flexible and lucrative. Couldn't this 15% in Jordan actually represent a burgeoning digital freelance economy rather than a broken system?
It's a really vital distinction to make, but we have to differentiate between voluntary, high-margin gig work in a capital-rich environment.
Like Silicon Valley.
Exactly. Versus involuntary, informal labor in a capital-constrained environment. While there is definitely a growing segment of digital nomads in Jordan, the broader categorization of vulnerable employment here points heavily toward the informal sector.
Oh, I see.
We're talking about individuals with university degrees who are forced into day labor, uncontracted service roles, or micro-retail. Simply because the formal corporate sector just isn't generating enough salaried positions.
Wow. So it's not the gig economy. It's driving a taxi with a master's degree in engineering because there are 0 engineering firms hiring.
Precisely. And the structural reality of that means operating entirely without a safety net. No health insurance contributions, no predictable income to qualify for a mortgage.
0 insulation against an economic downturn.
Right. When a shock hits, this 15% absorbs the impact instantly.
The psychological toll of that must be absolutely staggering. For you listening, think about that. We aren't talking about a population that just resigned itself to manual labor. This is a generation that grew up being told, go to school, we're investing 13% of the national budget into your brain.
Yeah, they did the work.
They graduate, and their reward is stepping into this precarious void where their advanced skills are just entirely useless for daily survival. It sounds like putting premium rocket fuel into a car with a broken transmission.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And the societal friction generated by that mismatch is immense. You're essentially stockpiling social and economic frustration.
Which leads to brain drain, I imagine.
Yes, the brain drain phenomenon here is particularly punitive. The state expended massive amounts of limited capital to educate these individuals. But because the domestic market can't absorb them, the brightest minds just emigrate.
To the Gulf states, Europe, North America.
Exactly. Jordan ends up basically subsidizing the human capital acquisition of wealthier nations.
They're exporting their most valuable asset for free because they don't have the domestic infrastructure to plug it in. That is, wow. That perfectly transitions us to Section 2. We need to look under the hood of the economic engine itself.
Let's do it.
If you have this incredible human capital, why isn't the domestic market organically expanding? Slide 4 tracks long-term GDP, and the top-line growth is actually undeniably resilient.
It's genuinely impressive when you zoom out. GDP, measured in constant 2015 US dollars to strip out inflation noise, shows a clear upward trajectory.
Yeah, they've grown from single-digit billions decades ago to well over $40 billion today. And I mean, we can't ignore the geography. They built a $40 billion economy in one of the most geopolitically turbulent neighborhoods on the planet.
The baseline resilience is a testament to highly pragmatic economic management. But top-line GDP only tells you the size of the engine, not how smoothly it's running.
Right, the transmission is still slipping.
Exactly. When we dissect that $40 billion on slide 5, the structural divide driving the employment paradox becomes glaringly obvious. The data splits the economy into two main characters: manufacturing and services.
Okay, let's look at manufacturing first. The data shows it oscillating in a band between 10% and 21% of GDP.
It expands and contracts, but it clearly hits a ceiling. It refuses to break out and become the dominant driver.
And because manufacturing hits that ceiling, the services sector is forced to act as the undisputed main engine. But the growth rate of the services sector is wild. We're seeing extreme, violent volatility.
High volatility is the defining feature there.
Swings from negative growth during crisis years all the way up to massive spikes of over 20% growth in a single year. 20%.
It's macroeconomic whiplash.
Yeah. How can any business plan for the future or hire a 22-year-old grad when their sector might expand by a fifth or shrink entirely within 24 months?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the volatility is the direct result of the specific types of services that dominate the economy.
Things relying on external variables.
Exactly. Tourism is incredibly lucrative, but it vanishes overnight at the first headline of regional instability. Then you have logistics and transit, which depend entirely on neighboring borders remaining open.
And remittances from expats.
Right, which fluctuate based on the health of the host countries.
So they are building a bigger economy, but not necessarily a smarter one. It's like a restaurant that gets bigger by adding more and more tables, but they never update their menu to charge higher prices.
That's spot on. And the fundamental flaw of relying on a volatile service sector is that it actively discourages the creation of steady, high-paying jobs. A tourism company isn't going to offer a secure, salaried contract to a recent graduate if revenue might drop to zero next season.
They'll just hire day labor.
Yes. They hire the informal, vulnerable workers we talked about so they can instantly shed payroll when external shocks hit.
Wow. Okay, but wait. What about the manufacturing sector? If services are too volatile, why hasn't manufacturing, which is, up to 21% of GDP, why hasn't it stepped up to absorb the 99% literate youth?
The answer is on slide 7. It lies in the specific quality and complexity of what they're actually exporting. And honestly, this is the most concerning metric in the entire profile.
Yeah, the trade quality. Total exports are rising, but the metric for high-tech exports like aerospace, computers, pharmaceuticals is chronically stagnant.
It's hovering perpetually between 1% and 6% of manufactured exports.
1 to 6%. That is the glaring issue. That's the smoking gun. When I look at this, I immediately think of the middle income trap. It's relatively easy to get off the ground exporting low-wage goods like textiles or raw materials. You just need basic infrastructure and cheap labor.
But escaping that.
Right. Breaking into high-tech exports requires entirely different thrusters.
The transition from low to high-complexity manufacturing is the hardest maneuver in global economics. If you run a textile mill, you don't need a workforce with 99% literacy.
You just need manual labor.
Exactly. The premium jobs that demand engineers and software developers are only generated by high-tech manufacturing. Because Jordan's high-tech exports are trapped below that 6% ceiling, the industrial base simply doesn't generate the demand for the cognitive skills the youth possess.
But why is it so hard to break through? I mean, if you have the educated workforce, why can't the government just say, okay, we're manufacturing microchips tomorrow?
Because the barriers to entry in the global high-tech supply chain are exponentially higher today. You don't just need a smart workforce. You need a massive, integrated ecosystem.
Capital markets willing to fund R&D.
Yes, deep integration with global suppliers, ironclad IP laws, and you have to compete against entrenched tech monopolies in wealthy nations.
It's the smile curve of manufacturing. The value is at the two ends, R&D and retail. The actual physical assembly at the bottom captures very little value. Wealthy nations hoard the R&D and outsource the low-margin assembly.
Unless a state can deploy massive amounts of targeted capital to subsidize a domestic high-tech industry like South Korea or Taiwan did historically, they remain trapped at the bottom of the smile curve.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because to build those thrusters, to subsidize that R&D, the state needs excess capital.
Which they don't have.
Exactly. Slide 8 shows us why. The state is already stretched to the limit funding the 13% education baseline, which leads us to the shadow of debt.
Sovereign debt.
The data on the state balance sheet reveals that external debt as a percentage of GNI has surged violently, crossing the 90% threshold.
External debt exceeding 90% of GNI is the kind of flashing red light that keeps central bankers awake at night.
Totally. And this is external debt, meaning it's owed to foreign creditors, usually in US dollars.
Which introduces massive currency risk. If the local economy falters, the central bank has to expend foreign reserves or hike interest rates just to maintain the currency peg.
Which chokes off lending to domestic small businesses. It's a cascading effect.
The immediate daily reality of a 90% debt ratio is that a staggering portion of the government's tax revenue must be diverted abroad just to pay the interest. It acts as an absolute policy straitjacket.
So every dollar spent on servicing that external debt is a dollar that cannot be spent on upgrading that stagnant high-tech manufacturing sector.
Exactly. Imagine the national budget as a fixed pie. You've committed 13% to education. You have healthcare, defense, public salaries. Now, a massive slice of what remains is legally mandated to be sent to external bondholders.
The sliver left for discretionary investment, for like venture capital, for local tech startups, is practically non-existent. The debt actively starves the future to pay for the past.
It creates a self-reinforcing cycle of stagnation.
And what makes this even more tragic is the historical context. The chart shows they didn't just stumble blindly into this debt. In the past, they actually brought it down from historical highs. They went through the austerity, deleveraged, and climbed out of the hole. But recently, it's surged past 90% again.
And why did it shoot back up?
Yeah.
Because when external geopolitical shocks hit, the highly volatile service sector tourism, transit contracted sharply.
Tax revenues plummeted.
But the state's obligations remained fixed. To prevent a collapse of the social contract, the government was forced to borrow heavily on international markets.
It's the ultimate mismatch. Your liabilities are fixed. The bond markets want their interest payment on the first of the month, regardless of regional tourism. But your assets are highly sensitive to the geopolitical weather.
You're constantly living on the edge of a fiscal cliff.
Okay, this paints an incredibly grim picture. The employment paradox, the 6% tax ceiling, the 90% debt straitjacket. But we can't just rely on the financial ledgers. When we look at slide 10 and 11, the actual lived reality of the population shows incredible underlying resilience.
The long-term perspective here is crucial. If you only look at debt and exports, you miss the monumental, quiet progress of human development occurring in the background.
Let's talk about the health triumphs on slide 10. The mortality data is astonishing. Deaths caused by communicable diseases have plummeted below 1%, less than 1%.
Just remarkable.
And the maternal mortality risk has dramatically narrowed over the decades.
What the health data shows is the successful completion of an epidemiological transition.
Right, the defining threshold between the developing and developed world. You defeat the infectious, waterborne diseases of poverty, and your reward is living long enough to face the chronic diseases of wealthy nations.
Pushing communicable disease deaths below 1% is a logistical triumph. It requires standardized vaccination programs, advanced sanitation networks, distributed primary care.
You cannot fake an epidemiological transition. You can inflate your GDP with debt, but you can't fake a 1% communicable disease rate.
No, it requires deep institutional function. But as you noted, the healthcare system now has to pivot toward managing chronic, non-communicable diseases, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, which are exponentially more expensive.
The paradox of development. You solve the cheap problems to unlock the hyper-expensive ones. And we see this exact same paradox on slide 11 regarding the environment.
The environmental realities are fascinating.
The data tracks mineral depletion as a percentage of GNI, and it's almost non-existent, near 0%. Jordan is not a petrostate. They aren't stripping their land bare to artificially prop up the economy.
Which is vital for sustainability. They avoided the resource curse, where commodity capital destroys domestic manufacturing and breeds corruption. They had to build their economy on human capital, precisely because they lacked natural capital.
But development always casts a shadow. While they aren't burning through minerals, urbanization is leaving a new carbon footprint. CO2 emissions from construction and agriculture are climbing steadily, from zero point 0.3 up to over 3.2 metric tons of CO2 equivalent.
That relentless climb is the physical footprint of demographic expansion. All those 99% literate young adults require modern housing, hospitals, road networks.
Pouring concrete is incredibly carbon intensive.
Exactly. The modernization inherently increases their carbon constraints.
For you listening, this really forces us to reevaluate how we view developing nations. We often hear they rely on mining or suffer from infectious diseases. Jordan has evolved past both, but now they face first world problems, funding chronic health care and managing carbon footprints from urban construction.
The state has successfully navigated the era of basic survival and is now deeply entrenched in the era of complex sustainability.
Okay, which brings us to the final critical piece of the diagnostic puzzle. Section 5, the rules of the game. How does the state manage this complex web of educated youth, high debt, and modernizing infrastructure without the system collapsing?
We have to look at the institutional software running the country, the governance and connectivity data on slides 12 through 14.
And I want to be extremely clear for the listener here. We are looking purely at the impartial, globally standardized data percentiles. We're not evaluating domestic politics. We're not taking sides. We are strictly analyzing what the data indicates about institutional efficiency.
Right. The data provides a very clear, objective ranking.
On slide 12, the metric for control of corruption fluctuates between the 55th and 67th percentiles globally. Government effectiveness has improved from historical lows to right around the 60th percentile, and rule of law remains robust and stable.
This raises an important question. What does a middle-of-the-pack governance actually achieve? When analysts see a 60th percentile ranking, the initial reaction is to dismiss it as mediocre.
Yeah, I mean, in school, a 60% is a D minus. It sounds like bureaucracy that's barely getting by.
We have to contextualize that. A stable 60th percentile ranking is a tremendous, highly bankable asset. It means the state is not an elite, frictionless technocracy like Singapore. You will encounter friction. But crucially, it's not a failing state. The institutional foundation is deeply stable.
The commercial courts render judgments. Property rights are documented.
Exactly. That functionality provides the ultimate currency for international business, predictability. When a global logistics firm deploys capital, they need certainty that a contract signed on Tuesday is enforceable 10 years later.
And we can actually see the physical manifestation of that predictability on slide 14, the hub economy. The metric here is staggering. Air passenger volume skyrocketed from hundreds of thousands to over 3 million.
Processing 3 million air passengers is the ultimate stress test for state capacity.
You need massive infrastructure, complex visa processing, international security protocols. A failing state simply cannot orchestrate that.
That aviation boom is the clearest evidence of the hub economy strategy. They are utilizing their stable governance and geographic location to embed themselves into the global network as a logistics and tourism hub.
It's a deliberate workaround for their lack of natural resources, building a hub economy in the sky.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. Demographics, volatile economic engines, the 90% debt, hidden health victories, and the 60th percentile institutional software. Slide 15 synthesizes all this. Let's summarize the 3 great policy imperatives.
First, and most critically, converting the demographic dividend. They have the 99% literate youth. Now they must upgrade to high-tech manufacturing to absorb them and solve the employment paradox.
Fix the transmission. What's the second imperative?
Fiscal balance. They must use improved government efficiency to manage that 90% debt burden while fiercely protecting the education and health investments.
An agonizing tightrope walk. And the third?
Upgrading the engine, reducing the extreme vulnerability of the service sector, shifting exports away from low-complexity goods to break that 6% tech ceiling.
It's a generational task. But the data shows a nation that has already achieved the seemingly impossible by eradicating diseases and illiteracy.
Absolutely.
You know, tracking all these structural traps, it leaves me with one final lingering thought for you to chew on today. We talked about how Jordan hasn't broken past that 6% ceiling for high-tech exports, trapping their youth in vulnerable employment.
Right.
But think about the architecture of the global economy. If a nation does the incredibly hard work eradicating communicable diseases, achieving near universal literacy, building a stable rule of law, but they still cannot break into the high-tech export market, is the problem really just a lack of domestic policy execution?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question.
Or is there something fundamentally rigged about the way the global supply chain is structured? Are the intellectual property moats and concentrated capital markets in wealthy nations actively designed to lock developing nations into a permanent state of producing volatile services and low-margin goods? Are we demanding nations build premium human capital while intentionally denying them the arena to use it?
The macroeconomic data strongly suggests the barrier to entry might be far more structurally protective of incumbent wealthy nations than the global consensus likes to admit.
It really makes you wonder how much of the diagnosis belongs to the patient and how much is actually caused by the environment they're forced to live in. Because as we said at the start, the X-ray is never simple. It's messy, infinitely complex, and deeply human.
Well said.
Thank you so much for joining us for this custom-tailored deep dive. We hope it gave you a completely new lens to view the world through. Keep questioning the numbers and keep searching for the human story hidden beneath the macroeconomic spreadsheet.